card-carrying member.
In North China, a war so old and far away that it has long since tumbled from the headlines drags on, taking its terrible toll day by day.
Starting in 1946, the war between the KMT, the Chinese Nationalists, and the CCP, the Chinese Communists, began, lasting 4 years and in the end, killing or wounding 2 million soldiers and leading to the death of 5 million civilians. The differing ideologies of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party, although both rooted in a sense of responsibility for the Chinese people, resulted in a contrasting focus on the civil rights of certain groups above others and led to the Chinese Civil War. Imperial rule in China lasted more than 2 millennia, ending in 1911. The last dynasty to rule over China was the Qing dynasty, ruling for 1,644 years. In the early 1800s, the Qing dynasty was starting to fail. Through the growth of the Chinese population, the needs of civilians were not getting met, and the impoverished started to rebel against the Qing dynasty in hopes of a change. If this wasn't enough, foreign powers started to gain interest in securing Chinese land and wished to develop control as the dynasty was coming to a close. The last factor to their fall was their lack of speed to innovate technology. As other countries at the time flourished with their new innovations to benefit their local societies, China was left behind. They realized they needed a change, and quickly. Qing rule was halted by the Xinhai Revolution. Though the Qing dynasty was already weakening, control and power weakened more so at the death of the last Empress Dowager, Qi. The last emperor was only a teenage boy. It wasn't long before he was forced to agree to armistice with Sun Yat-sen, the arch-revolutionist. Emerging from the new Republic of China were multiple political forces like the Chinese Nationalist Party. Huan ruled from 1912 to 1916. In 1916, within the arguments about foreign loans, Huan ended up in a fit of rage, murdering the chairman of the party and trying to save himself. With the quick appearance of a new dynasty revolving around his bloodline, he ended up dying 3 years later. The leader of the CCP led the Long March, a communist protest in which members of the party walked 6,000 miles to establish headquarters. The Long March also served as propaganda and inspired many young citizens to join the Communist Party from the late 1930s and the early 1940s. During the Long March, the CCP began to develop a new political strategy, a united front against Japan. Sun Yat-sen establishes the Northern Expedition, in which they try to rid China of warlord control. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen died, and Chiang Kai-shek took over and reunited China under nationalist control while fighting off warlord control. In 1931, the Mukden incident occurred, in which the seizure of Manchurian, city of Mukden, by the Japanese. While Japan was fighting to gain control over China, the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek was not primarily focused on those matters. Between 1930 and 1934, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party launched 5 separate military encirclement campaigns against their former allies, the CCP. For another 2 years, he focused on defeating the CCP, but in 1936, Chiang Kai-shek was confronted and detained by 2 of his own agents, Zhang Zuling and Zhang Huacheng. Both agents were unhappy with where he was putting his time and resources. They urged Chiang to move his efforts from being against the CCP to being against the Japanese, who were, at the time, attacking China, but Chiang wished to focus efforts on defeating the CCP before any movement against Japan. Fearing that China would plunge into turmoil if he was killed, many exhorted for his release. The CCP also wished for his release, as they thought his release could benefit their own interests as well. After 13 days, he was finally released and agreed to work with the CCP in their efforts against Japan and joined the United Front. And on July 7, 1937, the Sino-Japanese War officially began, the war involving Japan and China. In 1937, an important group was formed by the CCP, the New Fourth Army, a unit made of CCP that was not controlled by the Chinese. Yi Ting was appointed commander of the New Fourth Army. However, in 1941, the New Fourth Army incident occurred. In January, he was surprisingly arrested at the hands of the Chinese Nationalist Party and his troops ambushed. 19,000 were wounded, killed, or captured. Yi was taken prisoner for 5 years. This was the incident that would be the precursor to the Chinese Civil War. But why did this all happen? The CCP and the KMT worked together in the past, but what drove them to be so utterly resentful to one another to the point where they started the Chinese Civil War? First, let's break down their ideologies. What do both groups believe in? The Chinese Communist Party was, of course, communist, but what does that mean, and what did they promise to their people? Communism is a political ideology. Communism pushes for a classless society where communal structure is very important, where the means of production are owned and distributed by the people. With this ideology, there is no private property, and those in the community work together. The CCP was focused on gaining support from rural areas. This ended up being one of their main focuses. They pushed out propaganda to the lower farming class and promised land reform, improved living conditions, and a voice for the opinions of the rural populations. The CCP ended up gaining lots of their support from this class system and felt responsibility to help this part of the Chinese society. Focusing on the farming populations as a good way to spread their agenda, pushing for more communal society, and by the end of the Civil War, 7/8 of China's farming households were organized into advanced cooperatives. The Chinese Nationalist Party opposed the ideology of communism. They thought of it as dangerous and a threat to social stability, private property, and individualism. Many of the ruling units in the Chinese Nationalist Party were built up of the old landlord class, people often accused of corruption, and were scared that the Chinese Communist Party would discard their influence. Nationalism is a strong devotion to one's country, in which their devotion outweighs personal interest. They wished for a society which favored military rights and group solidarity. In the 1930s, Chiang pushed for this new program, the New Life Movement, which was supposed to get rid of the Chinese filthiness, as he believed that his party stood for cleanliness and respect, and using the New Life Movement, hoped to get rid of the laziness of the people. And he used military to enforce this, believing that he had a responsibility to fix the Chinese people and direct order to the nation. 1946, the start of the Civil War. There's 3 stages to the Chinese Civil War. The first stage was large-scale military operations and communist campaigns. For example, the Liaosheng campaign and the Pengjing campaign. On the other side, the KMT started their early stages of struggle and contributed to the CCP's early advancement. The second stage was the beginning of the major power shift between the KMT and the CCP. The CCP launched a strategic offensive and employed new tactics like guerrilla warfare, any military activity carried by a comparatively small independent force or unit. All of these leading the KMT into an extremely weak position. The third stage marked the CCP's final push towards victory. The CCP captured main cities like Shenyang, Xinhan, Chengdu, and the KMT finally retreated into Taiwan. In 1949, the war officially ended. Right now, the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial stands today in Taiwan. Though the KMT has not been present in mainland China, now named the People's Republic of China, the KMT is still a thriving political force in Taiwan. Both parts of the government have a responsibility of keeping their citizens in line with their views on the past civil movements. The topic of the Civil War is not talked about widely in China except for when they celebrate the leaders which helped make their country what it is today. In the People's Republic of China, they celebrate Mao Zedong's communist leadership, and opposingly, they celebrate Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. The policy is one country, 2 systems, as the main body of the country practices the socialist system, while the way of life from before its connection with China still stands as they still practice the existing capitalist systems in Taiwan. The Chinese Civil War, a conflict about opposing ideologies, has faded from many memories. The effects that the war had on China are still seen, as the issue of the individual versus the state still continues.